In this video, we are going to be talking about the ghost horses of Monongah, West Virginia. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm the Best Virginian. I bring you West Virginia history and travel videos from across the state of West Virginia, and today we're going to be talking about probably one of the most well-known ghost stories in north central West Virginia. That being the tale of the galloping ghost horses of Monongah. Now, there are several versions of this story, but the one that we are going to be using today is from Ruth Ann Music's Coffin Hollow and Other Ghost Tales. It's a great collection of West Virginia ghost stories, and I would definitely recommend checking it out, especially as we go into the Halloween season. And this story starts out with the narrator of the story telling us that, you know, at one point they used to use horses in the mines, and immediately this tells us kind of the time period and the environment the story is going to be taking place in. It's going to be taking place in a mine, probably before or shortly after the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about the early 20th century, late 19th century. At the beginning of the days, the horses would be taken from a nearby barn and brought down into the mines, and then periodically throughout the day, the horses would pull different carts of either coal or waste rock out of the mines using a cart system. The great W.C. Fields once said, "Never work with children or animals," and there were no shortage of either one of these in the mines at the late 19th century, early 20th century. And these miners really enjoyed working with their animal counterparts. The feral mine children, not so much. And that is a video for a different day. We're not going to be talking anymore about the feral mine children because they really don't like when you talk about them. And at the end of each shift, the miners would unbridle the horses, and they would do this great stampede up from inside the mines all the way back to their barn. That was, the narrator says, until the Great Mine Disaster of 1907. And the Great Monongah Mine Disaster in 1907 is a real-life event. In fact, it is one of the deadliest mine disasters in United States history. At least 362 miners were killed in this mine explosion. It was so violent that the shock could be felt from miles away. Houses shook, and even the pavement on the roads buckled and cracked nearby. Now, I've already done a pretty thorough video on the Monongah mine disaster. I'll put a link to it up here if you want to check it out for yourself. Now, the story goes, in the aftermath of the Monongah mine disaster, there were so many human lives lost that no one really talked or published about the loss of 12 or so horses that perished in the mine. But according to this story, it did make it harder, this just big pile of dead horses, for first responders to actually make their ways into the mine, which, after thoroughly researching the Monongah mine disaster a couple years ago, I did not, to my knowledge, find any details about horses. Now, you might be asking yourself, Best Virginian, of course, how would you remember a little horrible detail like that in this much larger tragic event? And you must be new to this channel, because that is exactly the type of fact I would remember and talk about in one of these videos, but I really didn't find anything about it in my initial research. And this is a great time to remind you that if you haven't yet and you like this type of video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. The story goes on to say that the 12 horses that perished in the mine disaster were made into a horse gob. I have no idea what a gob is, but in the story, the word gob is in quotation, so apparently the writer didn't know either, and this gob was pushed into a formerly used work area and completely sealed off. And months would go by before the mine was cleaned up enough and rescue efforts were made, recovery efforts were made, that this area of the mine could begin being worked in again. And when workers returned to this section of the mine, they noticed something new was going on. Something weird was going on. During their lunch breaks, when things were much quieter in the mine and miners were eating, probably pepperoni rolls, and resting up for their shift. It was dead quiet, and they would start hearing this rumble from very deep down in the mines, and it would make its way closer and closer, and it would turn into the distinct sound of horses galloping, and eventually this rushing sound of horses would go past them in the dark. Miners who turned on their lamps would see nothing. They would hear dozens of horses running to the surface, but they would be able to see nothing even with their lights on. It happened so frequently that the older miners, the more experienced workers, just started ignoring it and not even acknowledging this weird rushing sound. And when new workers would come to this section of the mine and experience the galloping ghost horses for the first time and ask, what is going on? What is that noise? The old-timers would start the story by saying, you know, at one point there were horses that worked in the mine. It's such a good story. It's such a great story. It just loops back around in on itself. It's so good. While this story is a great one, and I can see why it's been told and retold numerous times across northern West Virginia over the years, what educational context can we take and learn from it? When I was doing my initial research on the Monongah mine disaster, again, I initially found nothing about horses still being used in the mine in 1907. Then I found the report, let me get the official title here, Report of Hearings before the Joint Selected Committee of the Legislature of West Virginia to investigate the cause of the mine explosions within the state and the recommended remedial legislation related thereto of 1909. That's a very fancy way of saying they just had a big investigation to try and figure out what was causing mine explosions. And in this report, there were several questions pertaining to an individual whose job it was to monitor and oil an exhaust fan in one of the engine houses of the Monongah mine. They said typically whenever they would have to oil the exhaust fan, they would bring someone else in to monitor everything, typically a blacksmith of the mine, but the day of the mine disaster, that blacksmith was putting new shoes onto a horse that worked at the mine. So yeah, there were still horses pretty readily being used at the mine, still in 1907, which really surprises me that I was unable to find these in my initial research, but I'm not super surprised. Again, when more than 360 individuals were killed in this explosion, I'm not surprised that the dozen or so horses weren't super heavily reported on. And there are several ghost stories and legends pertaining to mines, but this one probably has its origins in the knockers or Tommyknockers of European origin. In Cornish tradition, knockers were entities, beings that would, kind of knock and tap on walls of caves in order to let miners know where veins of minerals were located. Also, they might knock or make noise in order to warn people of possible collapses or other dangers within the mines. That is if you were on the good side of the knockers. If you were on the bad side of them, what they would do is they would hide your tools, they would blow out your lamp, or just small little inconveniences they would cause. In order to stay on their good side, it was tradition to leave a little bit of food behind when you're done eating for the day. That way they would have something to eat and they'd stay in a good mood and they wouldn't start playing tricks on you. But again, that sounds like typical feral mine children behavior, doesn't it? I know I wasn't gonna talk about them again, but let's be honest, that's just feral mine children. They yearn to be in the mines. And when these legends came to the United States, they were adapted that these beings, these knockers, were ghosts of former miners that were trying to warn people of the dangers within the mines. And these stories even made their way into railroad folklore, where several tunnels have stories associated with them, with beings that knock on the walls of the tunnels in order to try and scare off rail walkers, because Yeah, it's fairly dangerous to walk along the railroad tracks, especially in tunnels. And I know there's probably one person who's made it this far in the video that's writing up a comment right now about, why do you care about ghost stories? As a historian, you should be ashamed of yourself. Ghost stories are just for children. Why are you talking about them at all? How can you enjoy making this type of content? How can you enjoy sharing ghost stories? And the answer is with friends. I enjoy sharing these stories with friends. You should get out and try making some. I hope you enjoyed this video. Every year I like to delve a little bit more into the paranormal, a little bit more into folklore and ghost stories, especially as we get closer to the Halloween October season. If you learned anything in this video, again, hit the subscribe button. If you would like to see me cover a topic or a story related to West Virginia folklore or ghost stories, let me know down in the comments. Until next time, don't forget to stay wild, stay wonderful, stay weird, and I'll talk to you in the next video.